I'm telling a series of stories looking back at 20 plus years of my life living outside my home country, the UK. One of the things living overseas all these years is that I've often missed significant moments in my friends' lives back home, whether it's weddings or the births of their babies or funerals. I've missed many of these important rites of passage, and that's been one of the difficult sacrifices of living overseas. I missed my grand's funeral 10 years ago, and that was difficult. Although creating a video of my favourite memories of her was a really great way to be involved in the funeral from a distance and was a good way of bringing closure. Funerals are one of those moments that bring us face to face with our mortality. I've often taken groups when I'm teaching into cemeteries and spent time by graves thinking and meditating. I remember one time taking a group in Germany into the Moravian graveyard in Herrnhut, and we stood by the grave of a man called Leonard Dober, who in 1732 was the first person sent out from the Moravian community into mission overseas to the West Indies. And it was great to stand by the grave with a group of young people, mostly in their 20s and early 30s, meditating and asking them some hard questions. What do you want your legacy to be? What do you want to do in your life that will truly last? Jesus was able to look back at his life in John 17 as he was approaching his death, and he was able to say, "I've finished the work you gave me to do." He knew what he was called to do, he did it, and he finished well. What a fantastic legacy. In 2018, I was able to go to the funeral of a good friend of ours in Cape Town. It was a long way to travel from Spain to Cape Town for a weekend for the funeral, but it was a significant moment, and it was a privilege. If privilege is the right word to use for a funeral, it was a privilege to be able to go to the funeral. My friend Pete died suddenly of a heart attack in August 2018 in his mid-50s. He was a fit man, he was training for a marathon. It was a complete shock and a total surprise. Pete was a friend of ours. He was from the same part of the UK as myself. He was from Cornwall. We met in 1999 when we were on our discipleship training school in Cape Town, and we were friends ever since. We served on similar leadership teams, and we met up often for leadership meetings in different countries around Africa, probably 7 or 8 different countries we were at for meetings, and we sat through meetings together and spent time talking after the meetings and processing what we were going through. I appreciated his kindness and his humility, his humour, his ability to listen to people of different views, and his wisdom. For several years, Pete mentored us in our communication team when we were working in Cape Town. We met up maybe once a month, once every 6 weeks, and we talked about different situations around the continent. Pete was in senior leadership in Africa, and he had a great perspective. He and I used to watch football together. He was a Liverpool fan and I was a Spurs fan. We walked our dogs together on the hills of Cape Town. We cycled and we ran together. And in 2016, we were in Spain when a crisis hit us in our region. In the middle of the crisis, we needed help. We needed people to walk with us in this crisis. And I immediately thought of Pete. Pete was a senior leader. Pete knew Africa really well. And Pete was good in a crisis. And he was a servant. And so I phoned Pete up and I asked if he could help. And Pete immediately jumped in and offered to help. And he joined us in our crisis team. We didn't know at that point just how much time it was going to take, but for the next 2 years, our crisis team was really the primary focus of his life. We walked shoulder to shoulder in that time. He was a faithful, detailed, hard-working person. He literally spent thousands of hours researching painstakingly. He lived in that crisis. He was a total servant. He gave himself wholeheartedly. And in 2018, a close friend, the son of close friends of ours, died in tragic circumstances in Cape Town, and he was there with his wife Michelle, walking with the family through that time of real grief. In May 2018, we met up in Dakar for a week of meetings. We talked about the death of our friend just 2 or 3 months before that. It was fantastic to have that time together in Dakar. I remember at the start of the week, Pete seemed to be really stressed. The crisis at that point was in a difficult point. There was a lot going on. There was high pressure, and Pete seemed to be withdrawn and quiet and quite pensive. There were 3 of us at the meetings from our crisis team, and we had a lot of time to talk and to pray and to process. And having worked together for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours in Zoom meetings, it was wonderful to be together in person again, to talk and to process and to weigh up different options. And as we talked and as we prayed with the rest of the leadership team, I saw Pete's mood lift. The pressure seemed to lift, and he left encouraged, and I was really grateful for that time. And so, 3 months later, when Pete suddenly died, I found myself on a plane flying down to Cape Town. It was really significant that I was going. I was going to represent our crisis team and to thank Pete and Michelle, his widow, to thank him and to thank her for this sacrifice in the way that he'd walked and served with us. It felt significant to go to help bring some closure for Michelle. The crisis had been this major part of their marriage for these 2 years. Pete was probably one of the least religious followers of Jesus I've ever met. He was a great listener. He was able to listen to people of any point of view, and he always tried to understand their perspective. He seemed to be able to hold the different sides well. He didn't just swing to an extreme, and so he was an excellent balance in our crisis team when we often had to talk about challenging issues and we had extreme opinions, and Pete was able to sit with the challenging views and find a place of balance. The funeral was held in a tent in the woods in Tokai Forest on the flanks, the sides of Table Mountain. I'd gone to church in that same tent several years earlier. A church met every week in that tent in the woods, and so it was a remarkable place to be for a funeral. There were 300 or 400 people in the tent. It was strange to be there, to look around and see so many friends. I probably knew 2/3 of the people there, friends, former colleagues, but I was there for a funeral. I didn't have time to see many of these friends, and so it was a strange, bittersweet moment. It was a beautiful spring-like day. There were no songs, there was no address, there was an opening and a closing prayer, but it was a remarkable funeral service. There were video messages from 5 people in different countries: Uganda, Brazil, China, Liberia, and then 8 or 9 different people stood up to give short messages. A Cornish friend, another guy from Cornwall, emceed the funeral. He did a great job at weaving together stories from Pete's life in a way that honoured Pete and honoured the other people. And the picture was drawn of a man who came into YWAM, into mission, young, and spent 3 decades of his life working in different countries around the world, totally committed to discipleship and to walking alongside people in their discipleship process. He was a great writer, and we heard excerpts from some of his newsletters, amusing stories and stories of epic trans-Africa journeys to remote teams that he was visiting. He was very self-effacing and humorous in the way he spoke about himself. But what came out was his humility, his gratitude for people, and his ability to sit with anyone, whether it was a king, quite literally, in one of his stories, or prisoners. He was the same with all of these people. And as we heard the stories from different people of his remarkable inputs and fruitfulness in their lives as he walked alongside numerous people, mentoring them in different countries around the world, his legacy was remarkable. And the obvious message was of a life really well lived that touched many, many people in more than 60 countries where Pete worked and taught. A very poignant moment was when his daughter Kirsty courageously spoke. She said that one of the things her dad had always wanted was to write a book with his stories, but he never did. But as she looked around the tent, she said she realised that we were all his story. As I sat there listening to this and hearing many people give stories from Pete's life, I felt kind of torn. I was in the middle of a crisis which was confidential, but I actually wanted to stand up and tell part of the story. I wanted people to know something about Pete that they didn't know. I wanted to actually boast about him in this crisis. I wanted to boast about his servant heart, the thousands of hours he had spent in unseen work. But I couldn't, and I didn't. And in a way it was more fitting that it was unsaid. But after the funeral, I was standing outside with many other people, and I noticed his 3 siblings from Cornwall standing quietly on their own. And so I walked over and I spent some time talking to them. And as I talked to them, I told them some of the stories of our crisis team. It seemed really fitting. And it was really touching to see their tearful pride as I boasted to them of his faithfulness and his servant heart. And it was precious to see their pleasure in learning something new about their brother. It made me realise that we never know everything about everyone. The funeral was a really significant moment for me. It was wonderful to have the opportunity to bring closure for Pete, for Michelle, to be there to represent our region and our crisis, and to thank Michelle for Pete and for his service. It was wonderful as well to have the opportunity to sit and to hear these stories and to reflect on the legacy of people who are the real fruit of a life well lived. Not finances, not a big inheritance, but people whose lives have been impacted. I was challenged when people look at my life. Who will they say are my story? It's a challenging question to ask yourself. As I was sitting in the tent, I was remembering, to my amusement, a situation that happened about 10 years earlier when we'd been in that same tent as a family for a church service. And it had come to the point of communion when suddenly a baboon walked into the tent. A baboon living in the forest on the sides of the mountain. It came into the tent and it actually stole the communion bread. It was a hilarious moment. And interestingly, just 3 months before Pete's death, when we were in Dakar, I'd actually told him this story sitting by the fire pit late one night. He, of course, found the story hilarious. He knew the tent, he knew the woods, he knew the baboons, and he was really touched by this story. And so as I sat in his funeral, remembering this story of the baboon, it was a strange moment to be in a funeral, but to actually be wanting to laugh. It was a kind of a surreal moment. And so that night I sat and I wrote a poem. And so I'm going to read this poem, and it's really, I guess, dedicated to Pete. You weren't in the tent today, nestled in this Tokai forest, in the shadow of the mountain, but your presence filled the place, your photos smiling out at us. We hear of your proposal on an Israeli bomb shelter and laugh at your hemorrhoids on an African bus. We marvel at your calm presence in a crisis and the 60 countries where you walked and talked and so richly lived your life. Memories are shared and tears flow like communion wine, painful but cleansing. And as I sit among the mourners, my act of remembrance is interrupted as my mind drifts back to another cold and crisp Cape winter's day. You weren't in the tent that day either, 10 years ago, but you would have appreciated the scene. Any church that meets in a tent in the woods is asking for trouble, and trouble came, walking boldly down the aisle, and leapt lightly onto the pulpit, pausing. The frozen congregation captivated by naked pink buttocks at eye level, then sauntered calmly back into the woods, irreverently clutching the bread. Our act of remembrance interrupted. And I told you this story just 3 months ago, late at night, under West African stars. And you laughed, picturing these woods and the mountain that you loved so well. You stood there, stooping slightly, silently rocking, visibly moved by the baboon who stole the communion bread. And today, in this same tent, these memories collide and conflate, and the absurdity of sharing communion with a baboon mirrors the absurdity of saying goodbye to you. But the laughter we share at this ridiculous scene lightens the heavy air like medicine to the soul. And I follow you out of the tent into the bright light of day. Blue skies stretching to the horizon, and smiling, for now, we whisper goodbye.